Now, for those of you that don't know too much about guns, I wouldn't blame you if you looked at this and said, oh yeah, that is a Glock. This is not a Glock. This is the Springfield XD. And before we start walking through its history and how it shows up in games and all that, let me tell you a couple of the key differences between this and a Glock. There's two that I really want to bring up here. The first is a grip safety. Now, a grip safety functions in a way where when you're gripping the gun, you need to make sure you have a firm grip or the trigger will not pull. The second difference is a loaded chamber indicator. So if you go towards the back of the slide, which is basically right beneath the iron sights that you're going to be aiming down, there'll be this little circle there that lets you know whether or not you have a round in the chamber. The Glock doesn't have either of these features. The Glock is a gun that you can just pick up and fire if it's loaded and ready to go. It has internal safeties, but all these external safeties and indicators are not really featured on Glocks because that would affect the overall simplicity of the weapon. So the Springfield XD could be seen as a take on the Glock for shooters that place more value on safety features on their weapon. So this was originally supposed to be a PLISKIN'S picks video. However, despite the Springfield XD being a very prolific weapon with multiple variants, there's not a lot of video games the gun is featured in that are actually worth talking about. I could think of basically two different notions, well technically three, but two of those games were technically the same game, Resident Evil 4 and then the Resident Evil 4 Remake. So I figured, I might feature some elements of PLISKIN'S picks in this by talking about the gun, its production, but this is really a RE4 versus RE4 video because the Springfield XD, at least when it comes to video games, is most at home when you're talking about Resident Evil 4. So I'm Pliskin, let's get into it. The Springfield XD originates from Croatia. It was designed in 1999, but produced from 2002 onwards, making it a pretty, relevant and recent weapon. This was a new gun around the time when RE4 originally released. And you'll see a trend with all the pistols most of the pistols in Resident Evil 4 tending to be very new, high-tech, and modern weapons for the time, and the Springfield XD is no exception to that. It was originally produced by HS Product, which is a Croatian company. However, due to US importation laws when it comes to firearms, a lot of these companies in Europe tend to have to work together with companies within the United States if they want to produce and sell weapons there. So in the States, it's Springfield that licenses and produces. So these guns ended up being known as the Springfield XD. Now the Springfield XD is a insanely versatile weapon. You can get it in 9mm, in 45 ACP, in 10mm, in 40 Smith & Wesson, and more. It's short recoil operated, and you can get variants that come with night sights. There's even a version of the Springfield XD called the XDS, which comes with a single stack magazine. For those of you that don't know, a single stack magazine is where the bullets are placed directly on top of each other. Most handguns that you'll see today are double stack, in which the bullets are stacked on top of each other in a little bit of a diagonal fashion to fit more in there. The one that we see in both variants of Resident Evil 4 is the Springfield XD in 45 ACP. You can tell that this gun is chambered in 45 ACP by the thickness on the actual slide profile and the large shape of the weapon. Coming down over to the original Resident Evil 4, we see just a plain old Springfield XD. Although the grips tend to be, I guess you could say, inspired by the FNP9, a different pistol, and you'll see in the original Resident Evil 4 a lot of the guns kind of feature elements of other guns, but for the most part are still pretty true to life with their depictions of the Springfield XD. In-game, it's called the Blacktail. Now, the Blacktail is special among the Resident Evil 4 pistols because it tends to be the fastest and has a crazy high capacity. Which means if you're not the type to go for your careful headshots, and you're not the type to line up enemies and really rely on penetration, and if you're not the type to really take your time and get shots from further away with a lot of power, like with the Red 9, the Springfield XD, or the Blacktail, is the best choice for you. You go up enemy by enemy and you mag dump into their body until they drop. Like all the pistols in Resident Evil 4, the Blacktail comes with a laser sight, however it tends to shake a little bit more in Leon's hands than other pistols. Now, while this is a optional pistol for Leon to start using in his campaign, in Ada's campaign Separate Ways, she mains this pistol, meaning that almost all RE4 players, despite their choices in Leon's campaign, will have some experience with the Springfield XD. It's also worth noting that in the Mercenaries mode, the Blacktail is Leon's default pistol. So it's very apparent that the developers really like what they did with this gun. I really like what they did with that gun. Again, it fits into the whole niche of, being a relatively modern and high-tech weapon for the time, so I'm sure the cool factor really got them to want to feature it as much as possible. But yeah, just like most of the other pistols in the game, this is a very sturdy and reliable handgun. Coming on over to the Resident Evil 4 Remake, we see the Springfield XD is still here as the Blacktail. However, unlike the original game, rather than having the grips be inspired by a different gun, the developers chose to round out the trigger guard a little bit more, just to make it different, probably for copyright purposes. Now, the Blacktail has definitely changed since the last time we saw it. It can accept a laser sight despite having the rail for it, and it no longer carries an insane amount of ammo, instead featuring a maximum 13 round capacity, which is very true to life with the 45 renditions of this pistol. While the Blacktail in the original was a contender for a pistol you could use, in the Resident Evil 4 Remake, the Blacktail is almost the best objective choice. It takes up the least amount of space in your inventory. Even though it can't use a laser, its reticle has next to no bloom, making it insanely accurate. Its damage is enough to deal with enemies and bosses alike. Its reload speed is good. It's an all-around great pistol. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's too good. This gun is so good that it actually has me rethinking my entire analysis of the Resident Evil 4 sandbox. You see, when I first played the remake, I was distracted by the new additions to the sandbox and how they improved the balancing, that I didn't really take notice of just how broken the Blacktail is. You see, you have guns like the Red 9 that are much better balanced than they were in the original. See, the Red 9 in the original was kind of like that de facto pistol, and I thought because they nerfed it with bloom and such that, we didn't have to deal with this kind of mentality of, oh yeah, here's a bunch of different weapons that you can choose from, just make sure you pick the right one, otherwise you're intentionally making the game harder for yourself. However, what I didn't notice is that the Blacktail kind of takes the role that the original Red 9 has. So while you don't really have to pick this up in the campaign as Leon, and while now in the Mercenaries Leon uses his Silver Ghost as his main pistol, the Blacktail is something that if you don't use, the entire game gets harder because of it. I've done a lot of pistol-only runs in this game, and I can tell you that if I'm not using the Blacktail, it is a much harder time getting through the game. And yes, I have taken the time to get good with the starter pistol and get those headshots and those criticals, but with the Blacktail, you don't even need to think about that. You just point and you shoot. Now again, this is Ada's signature pistol in Separate Ways, and it's just as good in Ada's campaign as it is in Leon's campaign. In fact, probably more so, because your only other two options for pistols are the Red 9 and the 5.7, or the Punisher as it's called in-game. The Red 9, as I mentioned before, has a lot of bloom and a slower fire rate, so if you don't have quicker weapons to balance it out, It's kind of detrimental, and considering in separate ways you don't get a lot of weapons or as many weapons as a Leon does, it's harder to balance out the weaknesses of certain weapons. But in Ada's campaign, if I'm using the Red 9, I really have to rely on that TMP. I could technically rely on that shotgun. The semi-auto sniper is okay, but there's nothing really there to pick up the slack, and either way, you don't really want to have to use weapons to pick up slack for a pistol in Resident Evil, especially Resident Evil 4, where the pistol is going to be your go-to 90% of the time. It's the exact same issue with the 5.7, or the Punisher as it's called here. The Punisher can take a laser, it's very accurate, it has a higher fire rate, but it's incredibly weak. So you have two extremes basically. Really strong but inaccurate and slow, or really weak and accurate and fast. And then in the middle, you have the Blacktail, which is the best of both worlds. And this brings us to our conclusion, where we talk about whether the original Blacktail is better or the newer Blacktail is better in regards to their balancing. I would say right off the bat that the original Blacktail is a much better balanced weapon. It's incredibly OP, but guess what? In the original game, every pistol aside from the Punisher is also OP, and when everything's OP, it really does become about choosing your preferred weapon and playstyle. In the remake, the Blacktail is just too easily identifiable as the best pistol. Once you start using it, you don't want to try anything else. You don't want to use anything else outside of just your own curiosity. But when push comes to shove and you actually want to start trying hard, avoiding those deaths, and going for good rankings, you're probably going to want to take out the Blacktail pistol, especially if you're doing a pistol-only run. And considering the fact that Resident Evil 4 is all about, here's a whole bunch of guns, all of them are equally viable, I'd say in that regard the Blacktail seriously fails. Now that being said, the Blacktail in the remake is one of the most satisfying pistols I've ever used in a video game. For me, what's really important is a balance of power and fire rate. And the Blacktail acts much in the way that an actual .45 pistol would act. You can feel that chunky recoil, but with enough practice, it's within your control. You don't get that much capacity, but you get enough for most situations. And considering that the Springfield XD really doesn't show up in much else, at least in a meaningful way, like for example, there was this one game called Depart Prototype, it's on itch.io, that you can try out where you can find a Springfield XD. It's like one of those body camera horror games, and yeah, I like how this pistol functions in the game because it's hard to use the iron sights and it feels more like an actual pistol and really shows the value of having a flashlight mounted to your pistol. But yeah, aside from that, there's really not enough out there with the Springfield XD to make a good PLISKIN'S pick video on it. So because of that, this is just a weird mash of Resident Evil 4 versus Resident Evil 4 and PLISKIN'S picks. Either way, I really hope you enjoyed talking about this really unique weapon that does not get enough representation. This has been Pliskin, over and out.
This is Solid Snake. Hey, subscribe to Pliskin Boy. God damn it.
You heard him.